Next fight on the main card, a really interesting fight. Gilbert Melendez versus Jeremy Stevens, and this is a good one, and I have a feeling here that the loser of this fight, it's not one of those loser leaves the UFC matches, but it most certainly could be here. Is the problem with a guy like Gilbert Melendez, the former Strikeforce champion coming into the UFC, is he's only 1-4 since he came to the UFC, since the UFC takeover of Strikeforce. And the problem with Gilbert Melendez is he makes six figures a fight. And when you make six figures a fight and don't win any fights, the UFC isn't going to be inclined to keep you very long, just because they can't make money off you if you can't win fights. And Gilbert Melendez is a guy they put on an Ultimate Fighter show, had him coaching against Anthony Pettis. He lost that fight, lost to Benson Henderson. The only win, in fact, Gilbert Melendez has in the UFC was against Diego Nightmare Sanchez in a fight that was way closer than it should have been. So this is an interesting fight here. Jeremy Stevens coming back up to a lightweight after trying featherweight for a while. Extremely unsuccessful down there for Jeremy Stevens. And Jeremy Stevens is another one of those guys. He's a big name. He's been around forever. But when you look at the stats, they're not very good. 24 fights in the UFC for Jeremy Stevens. In fact, his first fight in the UFC was 10 years ago, 2007, against Dean Thomas. The same Dean Thomas that we now see on those Dana White looking for a fight videos if you go on Fight Pass. Yeah, that Dean Thomas, that's who Jeremy Stevens made his UFC debut against way back in 2007. But when you look at Stevens' numbers, 11-13 in the UFC, somehow this guy is always ranked. He always gets big fights, but a sub-500 record in the UFC for a guy who's fought 24 times. I think here the name carries a little more weight than the actual pedigree and technique in the cage. Look, at 35 years old and a 1-4 record in the UFC, Gilbert Melendez has to win this fight. I think we're going to see a desperate Gilbert Melendez, an aggressive Gilbert Melendez. He has been on the wrong side of some really close decisions. Split decision loss to Benson Henderson, really close decision loss to Anthony Pettis. Gilbert Melendez, a tough loss to Eddie Alvarez. He has to get the job done here. Otherwise, he's probably going to be cut, because if you're 1-5 in the UFC and your only win is against Diego Nightmare Sanchez, the UFC is probably not going to continue to pay a 35, 36-year-old who's 1-5 six figures per fight. So I think we're going to see a really aggressive, really strong Gilbert Melendez in this fight. He's going to be the bigger guy. He's going to have superior wrestling in this fight. The power advantage probably lies with Jeremy Stevens. But in Jeremy Stevens, we've seen a guy who's lost 3 of his last 4 fights. When he doesn't land that big power punch, he loses. His only win in his last 4, I think, was that come-from-behind win against Dennis Bermudez, where he was getting absolutely destroyed, came back and hit Dennis Bermudez with that huge knee and knocked him out. But look, when Jeremy Stevens doesn't land those bomb power shots, he's not winning fights lately. I think this is Gilbert Melendez's fight to lose, and because he's 1-4 in the UFC, we're actually getting an amazing value here as a pick'em. I mean, this is a guy who was fighting for the UFC title a couple of years ago against Anthony Pettis, against Benson Henderson. Now all of a sudden he's a pick'em with Jeremy Stevens. I know he's 35. Maybe he's on the wrong side of the mountain as far as his career trajectory, but this feels like a desperation spot for Melendez where he gets the job done. This is another bet-on fight for me. Bet on Gilbert Melendez, basically at a pick'em price, and if you shop around, you can get -105, maybe even money on Melendez, although I have seen that line start to turn the corner, where most of the money now is showing up on Melendez, and the line's definitely trending that way.